On the evening of March 1st, 1999, a 16-year-old boy named Manny Corella sat with something uncomfortable that he couldn't quite name. His girlfriend Rachel had mentioned a job earlier that week, something secretive and well paid, but she hadn't told him much else. She said she couldn't. She told him not to worry, that the person she was meeting was an old female friend, that nothing about it was wrong or dangerous. However, Manny wasn't convinced. He thought the whole thing sounded strange, and he told her so. But Rachel had a way of moving through the world with a particular settled confidence, and she'd reassured him, and he'd let it go. That evening, she didn't come home. By morning, her parents had reported her missing, and by the end of the following 2 weeks, investigators had pieced together what had actually happened inside that apartment, and when those details became public, the people who had known Rachel longest found themselves trying to absorb a truth that didn't sit comfortably next to anything they understood about the world. The person who had invited Rachel that evening wasn't a stranger. She wasn't someone with a criminal history or a reputation that should have triggered concern. She was someone who had eaten dinner at the Barber family table, someone who had babysat the Barber children, someone the family had trusted without question, because nothing they had ever seen gave them a reason to do otherwise. This is the story of Rachel Barber, and of what it actually looks like when obsession is given enough time and privacy to become something else entirely. Rachel Elizabeth Barber was born on September 12, 1983, in Glen Alvey, a small community in rural Victoria, Australia. And from the very beginning, her mother Elizabeth had fostered something in her that would eventually define her life. Elizabeth played classical music through headphones pressed to her belly while she was pregnant with Rachel. It sounds like a small, cheesy detail, and maybe it is, but it tells you something about the household Rachel was born into, that hers was a family where the arts weren't an afterthought. When Rachel was 8, the family relocated to Mont Albert, a quiet inner eastern suburb of Melbourne, partly on the advice of her ballet teachers, who had seen something in Rachel that warranted taking seriously. Her father Michael was a toy maker and painter. Her mother Elizabeth was a children's book specialist, the daughter of Ivan Southall, one of Australia's most respected writers of children's literature. Rachel grew up between people who made things, and that environment left its mark on her. She had 2 younger sisters, Ashley Rose and Heather. Heather played violin, Ashley Rose played flute, Rachel danced. The creative gene, as one journalist later observed, ran through the entire family. But in Rachel, it had found an outlet that went beyond hobby into something that required everything she had. She trained at the Melbourne Dance Academy, and as she moved through her early teens, it became clear to the people watching her that this was not going to stay a childhood passion. She had the physical gifts for classical ballet, the lean athleticism and natural line that teachers notice immediately. But more than that, she had the mental commitment that separates the dancers who make it from the ones who almost do. By the time she was 15, Rachel had left school entirely to train full-time at the Dance Factory on Church Street in Richmond, one of Melbourne's serious dance institutions. Her dream at that point was performing in musical theater, and she loved cats and Chicago above everything else. She was also beginning to model on the side, not as a detraction from dance, but as a natural extension of the kind of person she was becoming. Someone who moved comfortably through the world and was noticed when she entered a room. She was also, by early 1999, 9 months into a relationship with Manny Corella, whose full name was Emanuele. They were the same age in the way that matters at 15 and 16, which is to say that the 9 months between them felt like nothing, and the people who knew them together remembered them as a genuine pair. Rachel had pulled Manny into her orbit the way she pulled most people in, not dramatically but steadily, and he was thoroughly there. She had brought him to visit her grandmother not long before she disappeared, and in that visit she had hugged her grandmother close and whispered something into her ear. She had asked whether her grandmother thought Manny was wonderful and whether she would welcome him into the family. 4 weeks after that visit, Rachel went missing. The Reed family lived across the road from the Barbers in Mont Albert. Caroline Reed Robertson, who went by her mother's maiden name Robertson after her parents' divorce, was 5 years older than Rachel, which made her a teenager when the two families first became close. She had babysat the Barber girls on occasion. She had been in and around the family's home during the years they all lived near each other, watching the particular warmth of a household that was full of people and conversation and noise, and the evidence suggests that what she felt inside that house sat uncomfortably next to what she felt about her own. Caroline's parents, Gail and David, had divorced when she was 16, and her journals, which investigators would eventually read in their entirety, described a childhood in which she had felt chronically outside of things. She had been bullied at school for her weight and appearance. And the self-portraits she drew at 14 speak for themselves, sketches of her own face surrounded by words she had used to describe herself. Ugly, fat, stupid, obese, worthless, weird, unwanted, loser, deformed, boring, and pathetic. She wrote anguished letters to her estranged father that read as the output of someone who had been reaching for help for years without finding it. In one, she described herself as a troubled, tortured, lost soul thrown into an alien environment full of angels. By the time she was 19, Caroline was working as an administrative assistant at a telecommunications company. She had no criminal history, no drug or money problems, no public record of anything that would have raised concern. On the surface, she was simply a young woman who had grown up near a warm and lively family and maintained a vague connection to them as she moved into adulthood. What the surface did not show was what she had been writing about Rachel for years. Her journals contained detailed physical descriptions of Rachel compiled with an attention that had moved well past casual. She wrote about Rachel's pale skin, her green eyes, even the quality of her attractiveness, noting specific features as though she had been studying them at length, which by that point she had been. Then, in the same journals, she wrote about herself in the terms she had been using since she was 14. Pizza face, brown oily hair, with no coordination. She had built Rachel into an image of everything she believed herself incapable of being, and she had sustained that comparison across years of private writing until it had become something load-bearing in her psychology. What investigators eventually pieced together was that at some point, probably well before March 1999, Caroline's obsession had shifted direction. She had stopped grieving the gap between herself and Rachel and had started planning to close it, not by improving herself, but by eliminating Rachel and assuming her identity. She had been photographing Rachel. She had even photographed her for a school project years earlier, which had given her access and a reason to look, and the looking had continued long after the project was done. She had been watching her from a distance, tracking her movements and her routines, long before anyone around Rachel had noticed anything unusual about Caroline at all. When Rachel was 12, she had mentioned to a friend that Caroline, who was then 17, seemed to want to be her best friend. It struck Rachel as strange, because the age gap made it strange, and she said so. That observation didn't go anywhere at the time, because there was no reason it should have. By early 1999, Caroline had moved into a flat on Trinian Street in Prahran, an inner suburb southeast of Melbourne's centre. She had been writing in her journals about the plan she intended to carry out, and what she had written was specific enough to be genuinely disturbing. She had laid out the steps: lure Rachel to the apartment using an offer of money for a psychology study, drug her, strangle her, place her body in army bags, transport it somewhere remote, and then assume Rachel's identity under a new name. She had chosen a name for this new version of herself, Jem Southall. She had taken Southall from Elizabeth Barber's maiden name, which was also the name of Rachel's celebrated grandfather, Ivan Southall. It seems unlikely she knew the significance, but the detail is unsettling in a way that sits with you. She doodled the name in her journals, writing the names Jem and Jemmy across pages, practicing a signature that was meant to belong to a new version of herself, as she was preparing to leave her old life behind. On the evening of February 28, 1999, Caroline called Rachel and made the offer. She said she was running a confidential psychology study, that participants were being paid $100 for a short visit, and that Rachel should come the following evening after her classes at the dance factory. She also told Rachel not to mention it to anyone, framing the secrecy as an ethics requirement for the study's validity. Rachel told Mani about it. She didn't tell him who had invited her, only that the person was an old female friend and that the work was legitimate and safe. But Mani didn't like the sound of it. He pushed back on the secrecy, on the vagueness, and on the fact that she wasn't telling him anything specific. Rachel assured him, and because it was her, the assurance landed, and he accepted it even though the feeling didn't fully go away. On the morning of March 1st, Michael Barber drove Rachel to the tram stop around 9:30 in the morning. She was wearing a gold necklace with a stone that caught the light and a blue topaz ring, and she had $13 in her wallet. She told her father she would be home by 6:15 that evening. Then, he watched her go. That afternoon, Rachel told her friends at the dance factory that she was heading somewhere that night where she was going to make a lot of money. She didn't say where or with whom. There was nothing in her manner that suggested she was afraid. She finished her classes and then she left. A woman named Allison Guberek, who was the older sister of one of Rachel's friends, was on a tram that evening and she saw Rachel. She saw her in the company of a woman, and the two of them appeared easy together and familiar. Allison didn't think much of it at the time, because why would she? Inside the apartment on Trinian Street, there was no study and no setup for one. Caroline had prepared the space in a way that provided surface plausibility, and she offered Rachel food. They talked for some time. At some point, Rachel closed her eyes, perhaps as part of what she still believed was some form of guided relaxation exercise, and Caroline strangled her with a telephone cord. Rachel's autopsy would later show that she had been given an antihistamine beforehand, something that would have impaired her alertness and slowed her reactions. What Caroline would eventually tell a psychologist in the years after her arrest was that at some point during the strangulation, she had a moment of doubt. She thought she had gone too far. She considered stopping, and then she continued anyway. Rachel had pleaded with her. She had said, "Please, please don't." But Caroline did not listen. After Rachel was dead, Caroline kept her body in the wardrobe in her flat. She left it there for 2 days while she went about the surface movements of her daily life, going to work, managing her routines, and doing the things a person does when they are trying not to look like someone who has just committed a murder. Then she hired a van, wrapped Rachel's body in army blankets and carpet, and drove north, about an hour out of Melbourne, to the rural property near Kilmore that belonged to her father. There, in an area of the land that the family had used as a pet cemetery, she dug a shallow grave and buried Rachel. Then she came back to Melbourne and continued working on the next phase of the plan. She had already begun the paperwork for a birth certificate in Rachel's name. She had researched train routes out of the state with V-Line. She had also applied for a large loan and was moving toward the departure she had been planning for months, the moment when she would leave her own life behind and step into the one she had decided to take. While all of this was happening, the Barber family had stopped sleeping. Rachel had not come home on March 1st. Her parents had waited through the evening, called her, waited more, and by night's end had reported her missing. They refused from the very beginning to accept the suggestion that she might have run away because they knew their daughter and running away was not something Rachel would do. They printed missing person posters and covered Melbourne with them and gave interviews to anyone who would listen. They stood in front of cameras and said her name, described her appearance, described the gold necklace and the blue topaz ring, and pleaded with the city to look. Caroline was present during some of this. She was a known face, a neighbor, someone with a reason to be nearby, and she expressed concern in the way that the situation required. Her behavior in those days raised no immediate alarm, so there was nothing visible to look at. Detective Superintendent Neil Patterson and his team began their investigation with the last known direction of travel and the last known contact. Phone records gave them the first thread. The call Rachel had received on the evening of February 28th had come from Caroline. That was not, on its own, a case. Caroline was a known family contact. But it made her someone investigators needed to speak to, and what they found when they tried to track her routines was that she had become increasingly difficult to reach and increasingly inconsistent in her account of herself. On March 11th, 10 days after Rachel disappeared, Allison Guberek sat with a police analyst and helped create a computer-generated image of the woman she had seen with Rachel on the tram that evening. When the image was finished, it accurately represented Caroline Reed Robertson. That image circled back to what the phone records had already suggested. Investigators moved toward Caroline with purpose now, not in a dramatic way, but with the gathering weight of someone who has stopped being in the background and started being in the story. At some point in the days that followed, Caroline's behavior began to visibly deteriorate. Her mother had already privately shared concerns about her daughter's state with Caroline's father. When police brought Caroline in for questioning, she was evasive and, by the accounts of the detectives who interviewed her, cold in a way that sat uneasily with the gravity of what was being discussed. Then she collapsed. She was found semi-conscious in her flat, in the grip of what appeared to be an epileptic episode brought on by the mounting pressure of the previous 2 weeks. Her father went to her. He sat with her, and whatever he said in that room made her tell him where Rachel was. He went to investigators and told them what his daughter had said. Then, they drove to Kilmore. On the property, in the area of the pet cemetery, they found Rachel's body. She had been there for nearly 2 weeks. Caroline Reed Robertson was arrested and charged with murder. Her flat was searched thoroughly, and what investigators found inside was not subtle. There was the journal, with its years of documented obsession, its detailed descriptions of Rachel, its self-loathing sketches from when Caroline was 14. There was the plan, written in Caroline's own hand, step by step, from the initial lure to the disposal of the body. There was the application for a birth certificate in the name of Rachel Elizabeth Barber. There was the doodled signature, Jem Southall, practiced over and over across pages as though the act of writing it was the beginning of becoming it. When investigators had questioned her in those final days before her collapse, she had initially claimed the death was accidental. That claim did not hold up against what her own journals said. She had planned this for months. She had written the plan down and had carried it out with methodical attention, and the attempt at an alternate account fell apart against the weight of her own documentation. In October 2000, in the Victorian Supreme Court, Caroline Reed Robertson pleaded guilty to the murder of Rachel Barber. She stood before the court and described herself as an unhappy and friendless nobody who had wanted to be somebody else, somebody better. She said she had become obsessed with Rachel because Rachel seemed to embody everything she had ever wanted to be, and that she could not locate a version of herself that felt worth keeping. Forensic psychiatrist Justin Barry Walsh told the court that Caroline had been profoundly disturbed at the time of the murder, though he was clear that she did not meet the legal threshold for insanity. The psychiatric assessments from 2 psychologists and a psychiatrist all reached the same conclusion. Caroline had a personality disorder, one rooted in an obsessional fixation that had the potential to be dangerous to anyone she directed it toward. Justice Frank Vincent made explicit note of this in his sentencing remarks, stating that Caroline would represent a danger to anyone she fixated upon. The prosecutor, Jeremy Rapke, told the court that the most likely motive lay in Caroline's infatuation with Rachel, her jealousy of Rachel's attractiveness and popularity, and the trajectory of her life. Justice Vincent, in his own remarks, addressed Caroline directly and said that she had been motivated by envy of Rachel's family, her beauty, and her personality, because Caroline had believed that Rachel would have a happy and successful life that Caroline herself would never experience. He sentenced Caroline to 20 years in prison with a minimum non-parole period of 14.5 years. In his remarks, he acknowledged a measure of sadness for someone whose self-hatred had been so deep and so long-standing that she had been prepared to kill in order to reach something she believed was otherwise unreachable. That acknowledgement was careful, though. It did not soften the sentence, and it was not meant to. For the Barber family, the courtroom was not a place that offered resolution. It was a place where a verdict was read aloud, where the legal record was completed, and where the name of the person who had done this was attached officially and permanently to the act. Elizabeth Barber later described that period as one in which the finality of legal process sat alongside a grief that operated on its own schedule, indifferent to what any court decided. During Caroline's years in prison, something happened that the people who knew Rachel found deeply unsettling. Caroline changed her appearance. Over time, in ways that were gradual and then impossible to ignore, she had altered herself to look more like Rachel, styling her hair differently, and presenting herself in ways that those familiar with Rachel immediately recognized. When Elizabeth Barber saw Caroline after her release, she said that the resemblance to her daughter was visible in Caroline's eyes. She would not have recognized her if she hadn't already known who she was looking at. The identity theft had never stopped. It had simply found a different form inside the boundaries of a sentence. Caroline Reed Robertson was released on parole in January 2015. The Barbers had opposed to her release, but they asked, publicly and with a particular dignity, that Caroline be left alone to re-enter society and hopefully give something back. That was not a forgiving statement. It was a statement from people who had carried this for 16 years and who understood that their daughter was not coming back regardless of what happened next. In 2004, Elizabeth Barber, writing under the pen name Elizabeth Southall, a decision that connected her to her own maiden name and to her father Ivan Southall's literary legacy, published a book called Perfect Victim alongside journalist Megan Norris, who had covered the court proceedings as a criminal reporter and spent more than 3 years researching the case. The book told Rachel's story, and the story of the investigation from 2 perspectives at once, and it was written not primarily as a crime account, but as a record of a person, as well as the particular warmth of the Barber household, the way Rachel moved through a room, the 4 weeks between Rachel's visit to her grandmother, and the morning she didn't come home. In 2009, director Simone North adapted the book into a film called In Her Skin, structured across 3 perspectives simultaneously: Rachel's, her parents', and Caroline's. in a way that required viewers to hold all three in mind at once without collapsing any of them into a simple shape. Ruth Bradley played Caroline, and her performance won Best Actress at the Milan International Film Festival in 2010. The film troubled people in ways they found hard to articulate, not because it was graphic, but because it was accurate about something. About how obsession can live inside an ordinary face for years and go completely undetected. Rachel Barber would be in her early 40s now. She would have been, in all likelihood, living the life that Justice Frank Vincent said in his sentencing remarks that Caroline had envied. A happy one, built on her own talent and her own choices. She had left school at 15 to pursue it. Her family had moved cities for it. She had a boyfriend who worried about her when things felt off, and the worry was the last thing he had before the phone calls started going to voicemail. 14.5 years. That was the answer the court gave. And here is the question that has followed this case ever since. At what point does a documented history of pain become a reason to reduce the consequences of a documented months-long plan to end someone else's life? Because both of those things were true about Caroline simultaneously, and the legal system had to weigh them against each other, and it landed where it landed. Reasonable people have disagreed with that landing ever since, and they probably always will. Mental illness as mitigation is a conversation this case kicked off in Australia in 2000, and that courts are still having today. If you have thoughts on where that line should sit, or whether you think this case was handled the right way, leave them below. If you watched until the end of this one, thank you. This case is genuinely difficult to sit with, and I appreciate you being here for it. If there is a case you think belongs on this channel, leave it in the comments. Like and subscribe if you have not already, and I will see you in the next one.